In 1979, a young woman drove into a parking garage in Connecticut. She was not walking into a crime scene. She was not meeting a stranger. She was not supposed to become the center of a mystery that would outlive the detectives who first opened the file. She was simply driving a blue Buick, her father's car, a normal car, on a normal day. And then, somewhere inside the concrete levels of the Temple Street parking garage, the ordinary world split open. By the time investigators arrived, the garage no longer felt like a public place. It felt like a box, a concrete box full of echoes, oil stains, tire marks, and silence. There were no helpful cameras, no digital trail, no phone location data, no automatic license plate readers, only a body, a car, blood, and a handful of traces that looked almost too small to matter. But one of those traces would wait almost 3 decades to speak. This is the Temple Street parking garage case, and the most frightening thing about it is not that the killer vanished. It is that part of him may have been visible the entire time, pressed into blood, left behind on a tissue box, waiting for science to catch up. When the police began their first search, the scene was difficult in the way parking garages are always difficult. They are built for movement, not memory. Cars come and go. Strangers pass through. Concrete absorbs sound. Footsteps bounce in every direction. And when something terrible happens there, the place gives investigators very little. Still, the crime scene team worked the way crime scene teams have always worked. Slowly, carefully, looking for anything that did not belong. On the floor, there were blood-stained tissues. Inside the car, there were personal objects that suddenly became evidence. And on a tissue box, investigators found something that could have been ignored by the wrong pair of eyes. A bloody finger mark. Not a clean print, not a perfect calling card. Just a partial mark, pressed through panic, movement, and blood. In a modern investigation, a print like that might be scanned, enhanced, searched, and compared almost immediately. But this was not a modern investigation. The evidence had to be photographed, lifted, preserved, filed, and hoped over. That is the quiet cruelty of old cases. Sometimes the evidence is there, but the world does not yet have the tools to hear it. The investigators had questions that arrived faster than answers. Why had she been attacked there? Was the killer waiting? Did he follow her? Did he know her? Or was the garage simply the wrong place at the wrong time? The blue Buick became part of the story. The garage became part of the story. Every small movement in that concrete space became part of the story. But the one person who could explain it was gone, and the person who had taken her life had slipped away. Her father, John, did not let the case become just another file. Years later, he would ask forensic experts for the one thing every parent in his position asks for. Not revenge, not drama, just this: do not forget my daughter. That sentence would hang over the case for years, because a family can survive many things. But unanswered murder turns time itself into a second punishment. In the days that followed, detectives chased the kind of leads that seem promising at first, then begin to dissolve. Witnesses remembered pieces. Names came up. Timelines were built, then rebuilt. People who had been near the garage were questioned. People who knew the victim were questioned. And every answer created another corridor, another turn, another door that opened into darkness. The case did not disappear all at once. That is not how most cold cases die. They fade by degrees. First the tips slow down, then the phone stops ringing, then the detectives move to other cases. Then the boxes go onto shelves, and eventually a murder becomes a folder, a file number, a name spoken by a family that refuses to forget. Years passed. The garage changed. The city changed. The world changed. Forensic science changed most of all. By the 1990s and 2000s, the tools that investigators could only dream of in the late 70s were becoming real. Fingerprints could be searched through growing databases. Old biological evidence could sometimes reveal information no one knew how to extract before. Cold case units began reopening files that had once looked impossible. And somewhere in storage, the Temple Street evidence was still waiting. That is where the story turns. Not with a confession. Not with a witness suddenly remembering everything. Not with a dramatic chase through the city, but with old evidence under new light. The tissue box, the bloody mark, the preserved traces. The kind of objects that look almost meaningless until someone asks the right question. What if the answer was never missing? What if it was simply too small to read? When forensic experts returned to the evidence, they were not looking for a movie-style miracle. They were looking for something more fragile, a usable ridge, a pattern, a biological clue, a way to connect the scene to a person who had lived for decades as though that concrete garage had kept his secret. The evidence was imperfect. Some material was degraded. Some tests could not produce a complete profile. That is important. Real forensic work is not magic. It is limitation, patience, and pressure. It is knowing that one damaged trace may be all the dead can still give you. Then came the possibility investigators had been waiting for. A connection. A name. A man whose story placed him near the Temple Street parking garage. When confronted, he had an explanation. He said he had been there for an ordinary reason. Just passing through. Just going to the garage. Just one more person in a public place. At one point, the explanation became even smaller. Almost insulting in its simplicity. He suggested it had been about stealing a car, but the question sat there like a blade. Why would a man drive into a garage to steal another car, while the owner was still there? And on the surface, that kind of explanation can sound almost reasonable. Parking garages are full of people with ordinary reasons, but evidence does not care how ordinary a story sounds. Evidence only asks whether the story fits the marks left behind. The bloody finger mark changed the tone of everything. Because a clean fingerprint in a public place can be explained. Maybe someone touched a railing. Maybe someone handled a box. Maybe someone passed through earlier. But a bloody finger mark is different. Blood gives time to a touch. It gives context. It says, this contact was not simply before, it was during or after. It belonged to the violence. Imagine being an investigator looking at that mark years later. You are not just seeing loops and ridges. You are seeing a hand in the room. A hand close enough to the blood, close enough to the car, close enough to a dying woman. And once that hand has a possible name attached to it, the case is no longer cold in the same way. It begins to breathe again. The defense could still argue. They could challenge the age of the evidence. They could question contamination. They could point to the passing of time, to missing memories, to the difficulty of reconstructing a scene from nearly 30 years before. And those questions matter, because justice after decades is never simple. It asks a jury to look backward through fog. It asks science to stand where memory cannot. It asks a family to reopen the worst day of their lives and hear it discussed like a puzzle. But the prosecution had something powerful. They had the old scene. They had the preserved evidence. They had forensic interpretation. And they had the one thing the killer had not planned for: time. Time did not bury the evidence. Time improved the tools around it. The same years that made witnesses forget made science better. The same years that made the case look hopeless made that single bloody mark more valuable. In the end, the case moved where every cold case family hopes it will move: out of storage, out of speculation, into court. The man connected to the evidence was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. For the family, that sentence could not return what had been taken. No verdict can do that. No number of years can rebuild a life that stopped in a parking garage. But a verdict can do one thing. It can say the name of the crime out loud. It can say, "This happened." It can say, "Someone did this." And it can say, the file is no longer silent. The Temple Street case is often remembered as a forensic story, a fingerprint story, a Henry Lee story. And yes, it is all of those things. But beneath the science, there is something darker and more human. A young woman believed she was moving through an ordinary day. A family waited for answers that did not come. Investigators saved evidence without knowing whether it would ever matter. And a killer walked away thinking concrete, time, and silence would protect him. For 29 years, it almost did. But some evidence does not disappear. It waits. It waits in boxes. It waits in photographs. It waits in the memory of people who refuse to close a door just because the room has gone dark. And sometimes, after years of nothing, one mark becomes enough. One bloody finger mark. One preserved object. One trace left in a moment of violence. And suddenly the past reaches forward. That is the terror of this case. Not only that a woman was murdered in a public garage, not only that her killer escaped for decades, but that the truth may have been sitting there from the beginning, small, red, almost unreadable, pressed onto a tissue box, waiting for someone to finally look close enough.